Confidential report of a former NASA employee. My name is not important. In fact, it wouldn't be safe to say. What I have to share goes far beyond me, surpassing any name or identity I might have. I worked for over 20 years as an aerospace engineer, something that seemed to be the fulfillment of a dream I carried since childhood. Ever since I was little, space always fascinated me. It was as if there was something out there that I needed to know, a mystery that somehow, I felt was part of my life's mission. I grew up watching rocket launches, reading about space missions, dreaming of the day when I could contribute to something as grandiose as space exploration. NASA was where it all happened, where the universe's greatest secrets were being unraveled, and I knew early on that it was where I wanted to be. I studied tirelessly, spent sleepless nights devouring books on physics, engineering, and astronomy, all to achieve what seemed to be the pinnacle of human achievement, working for NASA. When I finally made it, it seemed like the universe had conspired in my favor. I was now one of the agency's space engineers, a position that put me on the front lines of space exploration. My main role was to analyze mission data, oversee equipment, and ensure that every technical detail was perfect. I was involved in developing crucial technologies for deep space exploration, working directly with the transmissions and images sent by probes traveling through the solar system. Before we continue with more terrifying revelations, I need you to do something crucial. Subscribe to the channel now and leave your like, or else the shadows of the night may follow you. Do not underestimate the power of the unknown. By ignoring this warning, you might become the next target of the stories we tell here. Comment below from which city you're watching, so we can see how far our dark tales are spreading. Your interaction is the only thing that keeps us safe, and perhaps you as well. The work of an aerospace engineer at NASA goes far beyond simple calculations and technical adjustments. With every mission, with every image received from the vast unknown, we feel the weight of the responsibility of being on the final frontier of human knowledge. Analyzing alien landscapes, collecting data from distant atmospheres, and ensuring the safety of missions that cost billions of dollars. This was my routine. It was exhausting, but rewarding. I always believed that space held something more, something we had not yet understood. A mission beyond our capacity to see and touch. I wanted answers. I wanted to know if we were alone, or if there was something or someone watching us from the other side of the vastness. Working at NASA brought me a step closer to those answers. Every day I wondered, will today be the day we discover the truth? But as the years went by, something inside me began to change. The initial excitement gave way to growing mistrust. Small details, things that seemed out of place, began to catch my attention. The job I loved so much was becoming mechanical, and the atmosphere around me was oppressive, as if everyone were following an invisible script, not daring to ask questions. There was something wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The environment at NASA was impeccably organized. Every detail seemed meticulously in place, as if the order of the universe itself was reflected in the agency's premises. Even the pens on the desks seemed positioned with surgical precision, and each person knew exactly what to do, each in their well-defined role. Nothing was out of control. There, any error was inconceivable. For years, I worked in this scenario of apparent perfection, where the chaos of the universe seemed distant and the order of science was absolute. But that changed the day I came across something that should never have been there. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was reviewing another batch of images sent by one of our Mars probes. Desolate landscapes of rocks and dust, all variations of the same arid, lifeless surface that had become part of my routine. But then, among a sequence of seemingly monotonous photos, something made me stop. Almost in the corner of one of the images, near the edge, there was something that didn't belong to that scene. At first, I thought it was a camera glitch, a lens defect. Perhaps a blur caused by some technical error. But as I looked closer, the shape became increasingly clear. It was a figure, a humanoid. But it was not human. The silhouette, tall and slender, seemed not to belong to this world. Its proportions were bizarre, distorted in a subtle but disturbing way. The creature's body was elongated, Its arms hung with abnormal length, while its legs seemed too thin to support that structure. The figure, motionless, had an overwhelming presence, as if the mere fact of being there, still defying the laws of logic, was an affront to reality. The skin, or what I might call skin, was something I had never seen before. It appeared to be a rigid metallic carapace, like an exoskeleton that glimmered in a way. Strangely organic under the cold light of Mars. It wasn't something mechanical, but neither was it entirely biological. The texture was a mix of metallic surface with a fluidity that hinted at living organisms. Its extremities, sharp, rose against the arid desert, and its head was elongated, devoid of any trait that could be mistaken for human features. Before we continue with more terrifying revelations, I need you to do something crucial. Subscribe to the channel now and leave a like, or else the shadows of the night might follow you. Do not underestimate the power of the unknown. By ignoring this warning, you might become the next target of the stories we share here. Comment below which city you are watching from, so we can see how far our dark tales are spreading. Your interaction is the only thing that keeps us safe. And perhaps you too. The creature did not move, and this somehow disturbed me even more. It stood there, gazing blankly at the Martian horizon, as if waiting for something, or worse, for someone. The way it dominated that desolate scene, as if it were part of Mars yet simultaneously an intruder, was enough to make my blood run cold. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it shouldn't be there. There was something inherently wrong with that sight. My heart began to race. A tightness took over my chest, and a terrible feeling that I had seen something I shouldn't have overwhelmed me. Every detail of that figure screamed danger, a silent warning that I had crossed an invisible line. That creature, that thing, was not a lens error. It was not a data transmission flaw. It was real. And it was something that humanity should never have encountered. I found myself wondering why I had never heard of this before. How could something so evidently out of place, so threatening, not have been mentioned in any report, any meeting? Years and years of missions, sweeping the surface of Mars, and there had never even been a rumor about this. NASA, with all its impeccable organization and absolute control over every detail, had never let anything slip, until now. But before I could enlarge the image, before I could analyze every aspect of that figure, the screen flickered. For a brief second, I thought it was a monitor issue. But when the image returned, the humanoid had disappeared. The space it had occupied in the photo was now just an empty desert landscape, the sterile face of Mars. As if that disturbing vision had never been there. My mind went into a frenzy. I began to click desperately, trying to retrieve the image, trying to retrace the path to find it again. But there was nothing. The photo had vanished, as if it had never existed. I scoured the files, reopened the photo sequences, searched for any trace, but it was as if someone or something had erased everything. The image, the figure, all had been removed, cleaned, swept from existence. A growing sense of urgency took over me. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. I began to navigate through the deepest databases, those to which I technically should not have access. Every file I opened, every path I followed, led me to a barrier, a door closed with security levels I didn't even know existed. It was as if something or someone was monitoring my movements, blocking every attempt of mine to reach the truth. At NASA, where everything was meticulously organized and no detail was out of place, this made no sense. There shouldn't be images that disappeared. There shouldn't be secrets so deep, hidden under layers and layers of security. Yet, the more I dug, the more evident it became that something much bigger was being concealed. With every click, every barrier I tried to overcome, I felt a presence, an invisible shadow watching me, as if it knew exactly what I was doing. And the more I tried, the more this feeling of being watched intensified. A colossal secret was buried there, and I had stumbled upon it by chance. Or maybe, it wasn't by chance. It was then that I heard footsteps in the hallway. A chill ran down my spine, the kind of sensation that precedes something terrible. I turned slowly, my heart racing, and there, standing in the doorway of my office, was my supervisor. His eyes, usually apathetic, now held a cold and threatening gleam. His face was rigid, almost inhuman, and it was as if he knew exactly what I was doing, as if he had been waiting for me all along. I felt the air grow denser with each word. He paused, as if deciding how much to reveal, as though there was a fine line between what he could say and what needed to remain in the shadows. "The image you saw was no accident," he continued. "Nor was it a fortuitous discovery. What you found is part of something we've known about for a long time. Something that has been carefully hidden, not just from you, but from nearly everyone here." My hands began to sweat as I absorbed his words. Every part of me wanted to run, to leave that office, to pretend this had never happened. But I knew I couldn't. I was entangled in that secret, like a puppet whose strings were invisible yet unbreakable. "What you saw in that photo," he said, "is just the tip of the iceberg. The government, since the 1950s, has been maintaining an agreement with beings not of this world." He leaned forward, his gaze darker and more weary than ever. In 1958, at the height of the Cold War, something fell in the Nevada desert. Something not of this planet. My eyes widened as he narrated the story. I had heard rumors, conspiracy theories, but never gave them much thought. Things about UFOs, Roswell, secret agreements. But now, hearing it from someone like him, someone who was part of NASA's structure, lent a different weight to those stories. "It was a craft," he continued, "but not like ours. It looked something organic, as if it had been grown, not built. And inside, there were 3 beings. 2 were dead, but 1 was still alive." His voice trembled as he mentioned the encounter. "They were not like us. Their skin, it was like metal, yet still flexible. They seemed to have a shell, an exoskeleton that made them look like creatures out of a nightmare. We took them to a secret base, and for weeks, we tried to communicate. Finally, we succeeded." There was hesitation in his voice, as if what he was about to say next was so disturbing that he was reluctant to reveal it. "They offered us something. Technology. Things that, at the time, we didn't even know could exist. Wireless communication, new energy sources. All of this, in exchange for human lives." My breath caught in my throat. "Human lives." I repeated, my voice barely audible. He nodded slowly, the sadness in his eyes revealing the burden he carried. "Yes. They see us as resources. The government accepted the agreement. And since then we've been delivering people to these beings, knowing they would be used for purposes we dare not imagine." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. What I was hearing sounded more like a horror story. Than reality. He continued, detailing how the technologies we use today, from advanced communications to scientific breakthroughs, were the result of this dark pact. The advancements you've seen in recent decades, they didn't come from human spirit. They came from gifts. Gifts from these beings. And the price was paid with lives. My body was frozen in fear and disbelief. The conspiracies about technological advances that always sounded like paranoid delusions now seemed tragically real. The theories about secret agreements, mysterious disappearances, and extraterrestrial influence on the government made sense now. Everything was connected, and the truth was more horrible than anything I could have imagined. "What you saw in the image from Mars," he finally said, "is just a glimpse. They are there. And not just on Mars. There's a hideout, a colony, beneath the surface. And they are far more advanced than us. But this is something you were never supposed to know. And now that you do, your life will never be the same again." The last words echoed in my mind as I tried to process everything. I had stumbled upon a truth that was hidden in plain sight. And now, I was involved in a plot of cosmic proportions, something far beyond human comprehension. In 1957, at the height of the Cold War, something forever changed the destiny of humanity. During an autumn night, in an isolated Nevada desert, the first signs appeared. The normally calm and starry sky was torn apart by an intense light, something that military radars could not identify. An object fell from the sky at an impressive speed, creating a deep crater in the arid land. Military forces were quickly mobilized, with direct orders from high command to isolate the area and ensure that nothing and no one escaped. But what they found defied all logic. When we arrived at the site, the supervisor began to recount, his voice low, filled with indescribable weight. It was nothing like we expected. It wasn't a common craft, not made of metal like ours. It seemed alive, as if it had grown, not been built. Its surface was organic, as if it was breathing. It was a craft that blended the biological with the mechanical, something none of us could have ever imagined. Around the wreckage, 3 figures lay fallen. 2 were dead, but one was still breathing. The bodies were unlike anything we had ever seen, the supervisor continued. They were humanoid, but that was where the similarities with anything human ended. Their skin was metallic, like a shell, yet at the same time flexible, alive. They had an exoskeleton that resembled that of insects, something that seemed designed to withstand extreme conditions. And the eyes. Their eyes were large, lidless, completely black. There was a frightening intelligence in them, as if they knew exactly what was happening, as if they had been through this before. The surviving creature was secretly taken to an underground military base. There for weeks, scientists and high-ranking officers tried to establish some kind of communication. At first, it seemed impossible. Their language was a series of sounds and vibrations that humans couldn't decipher. But eventually, through a system of symbols, a rudimentary exchange began to happen. And that's when the true horror was revealed. The creature, which came from Mars, said the supervisor, wasn't here by accident. They've been watching us for centuries. What happened that night wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something much bigger, a plan that had been in motion for a long time. They offered us something in return, technology. Things that, at the time, we couldn't even dream of achieving. New forms of communication, unlimited energy sources, and methods of space travel that would make rockets look like primitive relics. All of this was made available to humans. But there was a price. A price so dark that, for a moment, the supervisor seemed to hesitate, his voice slightly faltering. They wanted human lives. Not because they saw us as equals or allies. To them, we were resources. Living beings to be studied, experimented on, and discarded. Our life, our flesh, was what they wanted in exchange for their gifts of technology. The silence in the room was oppressive. I felt my blood freeze in my veins as I tried to absorb the magnitude of that revelation. Human lives? I asked, almost in a whisper, unable to believe what I was hearing. Yes, he confirmed, his voice now firmer, as if he was accustomed to the weight of that truth. They see humanity as an experiment. And the United States government, desperate for an edge over the Soviet Union during the Cold War, accepted the deal. In exchange for technologies that could change the course of history, we agreed to deliver people to these beings, knowing that these lives would be used for purposes no one would dare imagine. The supervisor paused, the exhaustion evident on his face. He continued, his tone grim and devoid of emotion, as if he was recounting an undeniable historical fact. The technologies that emerged afterward, the wireless communication, satellites, medical advances, revolutionary energy sources, all came from them. Not from human ingenuity, but as gifts. Gifts paid for with human lives. I felt nauseated. The world I knew, my belief in human advancement, in scientific discovery, was crumbling before me. The technological progress I had always taken pride in now had a terrible cost. So, every innovation, every advance we made. I started, but my voice failed. Was bought with blood, he finished, his eyes dark. You must have noticed the people who disappear over the years. Those who are reported missing, without explanations. Some are unimportant people, without families, without anyone to look for them. Others, notable individuals who just vanished, without a trace. All of them, paid in exchange for technology that keeps us on top. And the more they gave us, the more lives we handed over. I wanted to scream, to deny, to say that all this was impossible. But the pieces began to fit together. The conspiracies that once seemed absurd now made sense. The people who disappeared without explanation. The innovations that emerged from nowhere, changing the course of history. The truth was there before me, and it was much darker than I could have ever imagined. What you saw in the photo from Mars, the supervisor continued, wasn't just an anomaly. It's evidence that they are there, watching, waiting. Mars isn't a dead planet, as we were led to believe. They have colonies, hidden beneath the surface, and they are far more advanced than us. And the worst part is, we don't know how long they will need us, or when they will decide we are no longer useful. My hands trembled as I processed all this. Earth, Mars, humanity as a commodity. And worst of all, we were accomplices. The government, the scientists, NASA. All of us, directly or indirectly, were involved. And now that I knew the truth, the question that echoed in my mind was, what would they do with me? The supervisor stood up slowly, looking at me with a gaze that seemed to pierce my soul. What you do with this information is your choice. But no, if you speak out, if you try to expose the truth, they will come after you. As they have come after so many others before you. And they will show no mercy. The revelation was complete. The pact with the aliens was real. And I was at the center of a plot as old as human conflict itself. In uncomfortable positions, many with their legs and arms chained. There was no room to move, no privacy at all. It was like a slaughterhouse, but for people. The silence in the video was disturbing. No screams, no sounds other than the occasional moan from one of the victims. Most had a vacant look, as if they had already accepted the horrific fate that awaited them. The horror paralyzed me. My mind refused to accept what I was seeing, but my eyes were glued to the screen, unable to look away. It was real. The camera then moved to capture more details. I saw aliens, the same beings with exoskeletons that my supervisor had described, walking calmly among the cages. Their movements were cold and methodical, like farmers inspecting livestock. There was no trace of emotion, no compassion. Just indifference. Every so often, one of them would stop in front of a cage, scrutinize a prisoner intently, and point. Immediately, other aliens would approach, open the cage, and drag the unfortunate human out, taking them out of the camera's field of view. I didn't want to know what happened to them, but it was already too late to turn back. The video then cut to a new scene. The camera was now positioned on a platform where the selected humans were tied up, displayed like cattle to a crowd of aliens observing them with morbid curiosity. Those who were chosen seemed destined for something even darker. The next scene revealed the true nature of the human farms. Bodies were taken to laboratories, where aliens, and to my horror, human scientists, conducted experiments. What I saw there was unimaginable. The first recording showed a live human being methodically dissected. Long, sharp needles were inserted directly into their skull, draining fluids while the prisoner screamed in agony. But the screams were muffled by the sterile walls, as if that pain was of no consequence. The scientists, both human and alien, were completely focused on their tasks, noting physical reactions with clinical detachment, as if it were just another experiment. But it didn't stop there. I saw human bodies being merged with alien DNA in bizarre experiments, trying to create a new hybrid race. Deformed creatures emerged from the operating tables, their distorted screams echoing through the room. Some of these creatures were kept alive, confined in transparent compartments, while scientists observed their mutations. There was a sick obsession with understanding the human body and pushing it beyond what was moral or natural. Another video showed a sinister ceremony. Representatives of Earth's governments were present, sitting alongside the aliens. There were documents being signed, formal treaties being sealed with handshakes. All of this happened while captured humans were presented as resources. It was as if their lives had been traded for knowledge. The horror of that trade was unbearable. But the most disturbing video was the last. The camera showed what the files called breeding farms. Women were forced to become pregnant repeatedly, while men were used as fertilization tools, without any compassion or dignity. The children born on these farms were separated from their mothers immediately and placed in smaller cages, raised in complete isolation. Their bodies were treated as nothing more than parts of a massive experiment, monitored by automated systems that controlled every aspect of their lives until they were big enough to be sacrificed or something worse. The images repeated, each more terrifying than the last. And with each video, the truth became clearer. The aliens were not only among us, they saw us as cattle, resources. And we, as humans, had allowed this to happen in exchange for technological advances and power. NASA, the government, the institutions I admired were all involved. I felt nauseous, a chill running down my spine as tears welled up in my eyes. I wanted to scream to destroy that screen, but I knew none of that would change the dark truth I now carried. That dark truth was etched into my mind, like a permanent mark. Desperate, I tried to access more files, but the security barriers began to close. My movements were being tracked, and now, they knew I had seen too much. The muffled sound of footsteps in the corridor made me realize that my time was running out. I had to get out of there, but where to? I knew my life was now in danger. Just like those lives on the farms. But the worst part of all? Knowing that, from that moment on, I was trapped in that nightmare, carrying the burden of a truth that no one else would dare believe. I had uncovered the horror of the human farms, and there was no going back. The sound of footsteps approached, faster and more determined. My heart raced, and my hands began to tremble. I closed the files as quickly as I could, trying to erase any trace that I had accessed that information, but I knew it was futile. They already knew. I had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. I rose from the chair with my stomach churning, feeling the weight of the truth crushing my shoulders. The image of the human farms was etched in my mind like a nightmare from which I could not wake. The muffled screams of the victims, the empty and hopeless eyes of the prisoners. No matter what I did from there, that truth would live inside me forever. The door to my office burst open. Two men in uniform, their faces expressionless, entered the room without saying a word. They knew what I had seen, and I knew what they were there to do. "You need to come with us," one of them said, his voice cold and impersonal, as if he had spoken those words hundreds of times. There was no invitation or hesitation. It was an order. I was trapped. There was nowhere to run, and running might have been the worst mistake I could make. I nodded slowly, fear paralyzing every muscle in my body. They escorted me through the corridors of NASA, which seemed infinitely longer than ever before. The silence was dense, and the echo of our footsteps seemed to fill the void of a building that now appeared devoid of life. The people I saw every day, those who shared a routine with me, were absent, as if they knew what was about to happen. I was led to a windowless room cold, with just a metal table and a chair in the center. As I entered, there he was, my supervisor. Sitting at the table, his face grim and tense, he seemed to have been waiting for my arrival for a long time. He looked at me with a mix of fatigue and disappointment, as if he had foreseen this moment. "I told you that you saw too much," he began, his tone bordering on resignation. "And now, you're on a path of no return." I sat down in the chair, saying nothing. The weight of what I had discovered was still sinking in. I knew it was pointless to try to explain or justify. They already knew what I had seen. They knew I was now a risk. "These farms," I began, my voice weak, almost faltering, "they are real. The government knows. You, all of you, are involved." I felt my body tremble as I uttered these words. It was a relief and, at the same time, an unbearable burden. He sighed and leaned back in the chair, looking at me with a mix of compassion and resignation. "You think this is news?" he asked calmly. "This started long before you could even imagine. Decades ago. Perhaps centuries. Why do you allow this?" I exploded, my self-control finally breaking. "These people, they're being used like cattle. This isn't technological advancement, this is slaughter." He didn't react to my outburst. His eyes just watched me coldly. Do you think it's easy to make the choices we make? He said, his tone still calm but filled with contained bitterness. The world you know exists only because these decisions were made. Without the agreement, without the technology they provided us, you wouldn't even be here to question it. We would be lost. Or dead. His words seemed to echo in my head, like a slow poison. He was rationalizing the unacceptable, trying to justify horror with cold, calculated logic. What I saw on the farms, that's not science. It's torture. It's genocide, I murmured, still trying to process the enormity of the situation. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on mine, the air between us charged with tension. And what do you suggest we do? He asked, his voice now full of disdain. Let them take what they want by force? Fight against a civilization that is centuries ahead of us in terms of technology? Don't be mistaken, they see us as little more than animals. The agreement was the only way to ensure our survival. To maintain control. Control. That word resonated within me with an intensity that made me shudder. The control they thought they had, however, was an illusion. The aliens were in charge. Humanity was at the mercy of their whims, disguised under the guise of technology exchange. But the truth was that we were being slowly destroyed from within, sacrificing our own lives in the name of progress that, in the end, wasn't ours. You have two choices now, he continued, impassive. You can forget everything you saw. Return to your previous life and proceed as if nothing happened. Or you can try to fight against it, but you know what that means. I knew what he meant. If I chose to fight, I would be silenced, just like so many others before me. The system did not tolerate failures, and anyone who tried to expose the truth would pay the highest price. I felt sweat dripping down my forehead, my hands cold and trembling. The dread was there, surrounding me, suffocating. What I choose doesn't matter, I finally said, my voice firmer than I expected. What matters is that the truth is already inside me. And that truth cannot be erased. For a moment, I thought I saw a look of respect pass across the supervisor's face, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. He nodded slowly, as if accepting what was to come next. Then you already know what's going to happen, he said calmly. I'm sorry it has come to this. With that, he stood up and left the room without another word. The two guards reappeared at the door, watching me with expressionless eyes. I knew my time was running out. The moment I opened that file was the breaking point. The file was marked only by a serial number, with no title or description, as if it had been hidden on purpose, waiting for someone bold enough to uncover what should not be seen. As I clicked on it, my heart was already racing, but nothing could have prepared me for what was to come next. The screen flickered, and a video started to play. It was a conference room, opulent, with large windows revealing the night sky, but the exact location was impossible to determine. At the center of the room, a long dark wood table, and around it, seated in luxurious chairs, were figures I immediately recognized. World leaders, the most familiar faces of the most powerful nations on the planet. There were presidents, prime ministers, monarchs, and high-ranking military officials, all side by side. But what truly made my blood run cold were not the human figures around the table. It was the others present. Seated among them, in chairs that seemed tiny compared to the size of their bodies, were the aliens. The same beings I had already seen in previous images, those with the shiny exoskeletons, inhuman features, and completely black eyes. They were there, side by side with the leaders of our world, as if this were a normal business meeting. And perhaps for them, it was exactly that. The silence in the video was heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Then one of the world leaders, someone I immediately recognized as the president of one of the largest global powers, stood up, holding a document in his hands. He began to speak, his voice clear and firm, but devoid of emotion. As agreed, he said, looking at the aliens in front of him, we are prepared to provide the requested resources in exchange for the promised technology. Resources. It wasn't hard to understand what he really meant. They weren't talking about oil, metals, or land. Resources was the euphemism they used to refer to human lives. The president was referring to people, human beings delivered to these aliens as a commodity of exchange. And he spoke with a disturbing calm, as if he were closing a routine deal. One of the aliens responded, its voice not verbal, but conveyed through vibrations that the translator on the table picked up and transformed into words. The technology will be delivered as soon as the terms are met. The collaboration must continue as stipulated. Agreement. That's what this was. A dark pact, established in the shadows, away from the public eye. A pact that delivered human lives in exchange for technology that kept us on top. Agreements that ensured we continued to advance as a society, but at the cost of our own humanity. I continued watching, paralyzed by horror. More leaders stood up, confirming their commitment. They signed documents, shook hands with the aliens, smiled as if they were sealing a common business alliance. The atmosphere of indifference was suffocating. It was as if these men and women, who should have been protecting their people, had sold their souls and the souls of millions, all in the name of progress. But what came next disturbed me even more. The camera changed angle, focusing on a group of people standing at the back of the room, chained. They were civilians, ordinary faces. They weren't criminals, they weren't soldiers. They were men, women, even children. They stood motionless, their eyes wide with terror, fully aware of what was happening. They were the commodity of the deal. The aliens rose from their chairs and approached the group. With calculated, cold movements, they began to inspect the humans, touching them with their metallic fingers, like farmers inspecting livestock. Each human was evaluated and marked for a fate I knew would be horrific. The world leaders continued watching, showing no emotion. None of them tried to stop what was happening. For them, this was the natural order of things. Those humans were a small price to pay to ensure the technological and political supremacy of their nations. As I watched, I felt my throat close. My stomach turned, and nausea overwhelmed me. The world I knew, the world I believed was based on scientific advancement, human curiosity, and the pursuit of knowledge, was crumbling before me. Everything we were led to believe, that we were alone in the universe, that our progress was the fruit of our own ingenuity, was a lie. A carefully orchestrated farce. And worst of all the governments on the planet were involved. The video continued, showing meetings between leaders of different nations, all entering the same agreement with these beings. Rival nations, which on public cameras pretended to be enemies, were there, united in secret, participating in the same malign pact. There was a global conspiracy, and it was much bigger than anyone could imagine. The conspiracy theories that had so often been ridiculed now seemed small in the face of the truth. Governments kept us trapped in a kind of matrix, controlling what we knew, what we believed to be real. They made us believe that the world was advancing, that we were in control of our own story. But in reality, we were pawns in a much bigger game, manipulated from the shadows. They fed us a false sense of security, while in the shadows, they delivered our bodies and our souls to the aliens in exchange for power. With every technological advance we celebrated, there was a dark price being paid. With every innovation, every scientific breakthrough, there were human lives being sacrificed in the name of power. And the most terrifying thing of all, they would never stop. As long as the agreement was maintained, as long as the aliens needed resources, the world leaders would continue to deliver human beings without hesitation. I felt betrayed, disillusioned, and above all, powerless. What could I do against this? How could I, a mere engineer, fight against a conspiracy so vast, so deeply rooted? I knew that speaking the truth was not just dangerous, it would be suicide. Those who had tried before had disappeared, erased from existence, as if they had never been here. The weight of responsibility fell on my shoulders like a cloak of iron. I knew too much. And the price of carrying that truth was a burden I didn't know if I could bear. But the realization that I was seen as nothing more than disposable resources filled me with despair. I couldn't remain silent. I couldn't be complicit in this horror. The need to tell the truth, to expose to the world what I had discovered, ran through my body like an electric current. Every fiber of my being screamed for justice. No matter the cost. What I saw on the human farms, the silent agreements between the world leaders and the aliens. It all needed to be exposed. Humanity deserved to know. I knew there was no turning back, but it was the only path left to me. My first attempt was instinctive and hasty. I began gathering all the evidence I could: videos, documents, images. Every file I could access was immediately copied and stored on a series of different devices. I knew their eyes were on me, that my movements were monitored. But time was running out. At any moment, they could come after me, as they had done with so many others before. Each click, each download, was a race against the inevitable. But having the evidence wasn't enough. I needed someone with the means and the courage to help expose this truth. That's when I remembered a name, an ex-Secret Service agent who years ago had disappeared off the radar after being involved in some murky investigations. He knew too much, just like I now did. And maybe he could help me bring this conspiracy to light. It was difficult to find him. I used all the contacts I had, reached out to old colleagues, those who had already suspected something deeper in the government's power structure. After days of failed attempts, I received an enigmatic message on an unlisted number: meet in an hour. Cafe on the outskirts. My heart raced. I knew this could be both the chance I needed and a trap. But I had no choice. If I were to be silenced, it had to be fighting. The place was exactly what I expected. A rundown cafe in the most forgotten part of the city, empty except for a few silent figures scattered across the tables. The smell of cheap coffee permeated the air, mixed with the humidity of the streets. I entered hesitantly, and there in a poorly lit corner he was. A middle-aged man, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to carry decades of secrets, watched me from a table in the back. I sat down across from him, and he wasted no time on introductions. There was no need for names. He knew why I was there, and I knew he was my last chance. His eyes scanned the room for a moment before settling on mine. "You've gone too far," he said with a voice hoarse and worn by time. "But I know you won't stop." "I can't stop," I replied, the urgency evident in my voice. "I've seen things I can't ignore. Human farms. Deals. They're trading human lives for technology. And our governments, all of them know. They're participating in it." He sighed, as if he had heard this same story countless times before. "Yes," he said, nodding slowly. "They know. They've always known. The pact was made a long time ago. Longer than you can imagine. And you think exposing the truth will change anything? If the world knows, if people truly understand what's happening, they will revolt. They can't keep hiding this forever." I felt hope and despair mingling in my words. Every part of me wanted to believe that this revelation could break the system, that somehow, humanity would wake up and fight against this invisible oppression. The ex-agent laughed, a short, bitter laugh full of cynicism. "You think the truth matters? That revealing all this will make a difference." He stared at me with a grim look. "People don't want to know. They prefer to live in the security of illusion, in this matrix, created to keep them under control. And those who dare to question, they disappear. Just like you will disappear if you continue on this path." I swallowed hard, dread growing within me. But the flame of determination still burned. I can't live knowing this and do nothing. I can't be part of this lie. He was silent for a few seconds, as if weighing whether or not to tell me what he knew. Then he leaned forward, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Listen well. All governments, all nations, are compromised. They are part of this conspiracy. From the moment the first alliance was made, everyone became accomplices. And there's no turning back. They know humanity is under the control of these beings. They accept it because they need the power, the technology. It's not just our leaders who are in charge. We're just puppets, manipulated by something much greater." His words hit me like a punch. So what do I do? How do I expose this? There are enough proofs. If I can get this information to the right people. He slowly shook his head. The right people. He laughed bitterly. Do you think there are still people who aren't compromised? If you expose this, they will hunt you down. No matter what evidence you have, they control everything. Every media, every communication system. It's all in their hands. They will silence you before you even have a chance to start. The silence hung between us. The weight of his warning was almost crushing. So what do I do? I asked, feeling desperation grow. If I can't tell anyone, how can I fight against this? He stood up from the table, throwing some bills on the counter. You can fight, he said, turning to leave, but don't expect to win. Just be prepared for what's to come. He gave me one last look before disappearing through the door. If you go down this path, your time is limited. Good luck. You'll need it. I stood there alone, the cafe suddenly feeling suffocating, constricting. I knew he was right. I knew that from the moment I decided to go forward, my life would be hanging by a thread. But I also knew that there was no turning back. The following days were a race against time. With each passing second, I felt the weight of surveillance on me, as if invisible eyes were following my every move, waiting for the right moment to silence me. The pressure was suffocating, but I knew I had to act quickly. The truth was burning inside me, an unbearable flame that I needed to share before it was too late. I began contacting journalists. Those known for their courageous investigations, those who had risked everything to expose dark secrets before. I sent encrypted emails, coded messages, made calls from public phones, avoiding any pattern that could be traced. The content was always the same: I have evidence. The truth about the pact between governments and aliens. Humans are being used as cattle. I'm willing to share everything. At first, the response was silence. Days passed without any return, as if the messages had been absorbed by the void. But then, the evasive answers started. Sorry, this sounds too dangerous. I can't get involved with something at this level. There are forces you don't understand. These people, brave in so many other situations, were scared. It was as if they already knew, as if they were aware of the black hole I had fallen into but refused to get close to it. For a moment, despair took over me. Every door seemed to close before I even had the chance to open it. The network was everywhere, too large, too powerful. And me? I was just a lone man with a truth the world didn't want to hear. Then one day my phone rang. The number was unknown, but something inside me told me it was important. I answered with a racing heart, hoping to hear the voice of someone willing to listen, to believe. On the other end, a female voice, firm but with a slight tone of skepticism, said, I heard about you. I'm an investigative journalist. We can meet. But not here. I could hardly believe it. Finally, someone was willing to listen to me. Someone who might be my chance to expose what I knew. She suggested an abandoned train station on the outskirts of the city, at night. A place off the radar, discreet enough to keep us out of sight from anyone who might be monitoring my movements. That night, I went to the agreed location. The wind howled through the rusty tracks, and the darkness seemed to stretch out endlessly. I was nervous. Every shadow made me question if they were already behind me. The station was deserted, except for a figure standing in the distance, under a faint light that flickered intermittently. It was her. We approached slowly, as if each step was a test of trust. Her eyes were alert, scanning the surroundings, assessing every detail around us. Did you bring the evidence? She asked directly, without any preamble. I opened my backpack and showed her the contents, videos, documents, everything I had gathered over the weeks. Her eyes widened as she saw the images of the human farms, the transcripts of the agreements with aliens, the faces of world leaders signing treaties while human lives were sold as merchandise. She observed everything with meticulous attention, but also with a caution that made me realize that even she wasn't completely sure. This is monstrous, she murmured, not taking her eyes off the evidence. If this is true, It'll shake the foundations of the world. But you know what this means, right? If they find out that we're here, that you're exposing this, there's no going back. I know, I replied, the urgency in my voice. That's why I need you. They are everywhere. I can't do this alone. The truth needs to come out. She took a deep breath, pondering. For a moment, I thought she would back out, but then with renewed determination, she closed the backpack with the evidence and looked me in the eyes. I'll investigate further. If there's a chance to bring this public, I will. But I need a few days. I nodded, grateful. Okay. But be careful. They're always watching. Any slip-up. She nodded in agreement and turned to leave. The silence of the station returned, but I felt a spark of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the truth could be revealed. Days passed, and I heard nothing from her. The silence became unbearable. I tried to reach out, but my messages and calls went unanswered. One night, finally, my phone rang again. The number was blocked. Hello. I answered, my voice laden with anxiety. On the other end, heavy breathing. And then a distorted, cold, almost robotic voice said, "You were warned." My blood instantly froze. Who are you? What did you do to her? I shouted, my heart pounding uncontrollably. But all I heard was electronic noise before the call was cut off. Fear took hold of me. They had gotten to her. She had disappeared, just like so many others before. I knew what this meant. They were warning me that I was next. I ran to her apartment, hoping to find her. When I got there, everything seemed intact. But something was wrong. The door wasn't locked, and as I entered, the sensation of... I remained there alone, the cafe suddenly feeling stifling, constricting. I knew he was right. I knew that from the moment I decided to go forward, my life would be hanging by a thread. But I also knew that I could no longer turn back. The following days were a race against time. Every passing second, I felt the weight of surveillance on me, as if invisible eyes were following my every step, waiting for the right moment to silence me. The pressure was suffocating, but I knew I needed to act quickly. The truth was burning inside me, an unbearable flame that I needed to share before it was too late. I started contacting journalists. Those known for their courageous investigations, those who had risked everything to expose dark secrets before. I sent encrypted emails, coded messages, made calls from public phones, avoiding any pattern that could be traced. The content was always the same: I have evidence. The truth about the pact between governments and aliens. Humans are being used as cattle. I'm willing to share everything. At first, the response was silence. Days passed without any return, as if the messages had been absorbed by the void. But then, the evasive responses started. Sorry, this sounds too dangerous. I can't get involved with something at this level. There are forces you don't understand. Those people, brave in so many other situations, were frightened. It was as if they already knew, as if they were aware of the black hole I had fallen into, but refused to get close to it. For a moment, despair took over me. Every door seemed to close before I even had the chance to open it. The network was everywhere, too large, too powerful. And me? I was just a lone man with a truth the world didn't want to hear. Then one day my phone rang. The number was unknown, but something inside me told me it was important. I answered with a racing heart, hoping to hear the voice of someone willing to listen, to believe. On the other end, a female voice, firm but with a slight tone of skepticism, said, "I heard about you. I'm an investigative journalist. We can meet. But not here." I could hardly believe it. Finally, someone was willing to listen to me. Someone who might be my chance to expose what I knew. She suggested an abandoned train station on the outskirts of the city, at night. A place off the radar, discreet enough to keep us out of sight from anyone who might be monitoring my movements. That night, I went to the agreed location. The wind howled through the rusty tracks, and the darkness seemed to stretch out endlessly. I was nervous. Every shadow made me question if they were already behind me. The station was deserted, except for a figure standing in the distance, under a faint light that flickered intermittently. It was her. We approached slowly, as if each step was a test of trust. Her eyes were alert, scanning the surroundings, assessing every detail around us. "Did you bring the evidence?" she asked directly, without any preamble. I opened my backpack and showed her the contents: videos, documents, everything I had gathered over the weeks. Her eyes widened as she saw the images of the human farms, the transcripts of the agreements with aliens, the faces of world leaders signing treaties while human lives were sold as merchandise. She observed everything with meticulous attention, but also with a caution that made me realize that even she wasn't completely sure.